Apparently, my co-host didn't get the all-black memo here as we decided to do our TED Talk. And nobody better to help with that TED Talk than GZERO correspondent, Alex Kliment, our friend who's going to help us break down tariffs. He's going to help us break down the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, something Trump said last week in the Oval Office. Alex, good to see you, buddy, as always.
All right. How you fellas doing? Hello, Mike. Hello, Nick.
He's got a great microphone. We're hearing you live and clear. Go ahead, tell the people about your microphones. You was telling us off air.
You guys are not the only ones on this podcast who can have the nice microphone and headphones. All right. Your monopoly on that ends. This is my liberation day. All right. Been treated very unfairly for a long time, and now I have my own.
Yep. Well, what's great is that for Liberation Day, what I've learned about this new phrase is that you basically tell your friends you're going to tax them because they've been taking advantage of your friendship. And now I don't know if we even want to be friends. Right. Exactly. So, Alex, listen, last time we had you on, we were talking about the election hadn't happened yet, if I recall.
Right.
And we were talking about the differences between Trump 2.0 if he came back versus what Kamala Harris would do.
Right.
Now that Trump has been here over these last 80 days, and you can get into tariffs if you want to in your response, but what are some things that have been focal point for you where you're like, I called that, or we called that at GZERO? And now what has also been something where you're like, man, I did not see that coming at all, AKA Panama Canal, Greenland. What are some things in either direction for you over these last 80 days of the administration?
I think what we thought was coming was that Trump would be much better organized this time around than he was in his first term, that he would have a much more ideologically aligned and organizationally tight team around him. I mean, he's still Trump, right? He still does the Trump show all the time. That's not going to change, but the people around him are much more serious this time. I mean, if you remember, the turnover in the first administration was ridiculous, right? I mean, we were measuring the length of, his top cabinet's positions in like Scaramucci's. What was a Scaramucci was like 12 days, 11 days, whatever it was. I mean, people were barely lasting that, right? Who remembers Rex Tillerson, right? This time around, the team is much more, and I think that was partly because he didn't expect to actually win in 2016, right? So he was sort of doing it on the fly. This time he came in with a team that was very put together. There are certainly differences in it, right? I mean, there's like the, Elon Musk wing of MAGA, and there's the sort of hardcore Steve Bannon wing, Steve Miller wing of MAGA. There are fissures within this set for sure, but it is a much tighter set and much better organized, I think, than it was the first time around. One thing I did not expect Trump to do was to threaten to take over Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal in the first week in office. And I think that, in a way, speaks to him being just much more comfortable putting out this expansive idea that the world is a series of spheres of influence, and the United States has its sphere of influence, and values aren't what matters, and power is what matters. And these are three key, economic or strategic zones in the Western Hemisphere that Trump looks at the map and says, yeah, these should belong to us. So I think I didn't expect him to go quite so far, quite so quickly, but I think it's of a piece with, the way he's thought about the world for the past 8 years, but really for the past 40 years.
So let me ask you, because, there's a part of the world that you cover and you speak the language, and that's Russian. And you and I were talking about this again before the election in terms of the war in Ukraine. And obviously, President Trump ran on, I could end it. It would never have happened. One's a hypothetical. The other one hasn't actually happened, right? Which is the war is still ongoing. So I'm curious for you, because there's some late breaking news, basically, as we're recording this over the last couple of days, of the Chinese soldiers that were captured by Ukraine, and that was kind of put out. Trump said he's going to investigate that. We'll see where that nets out. We all know how well investigations happen under his administration. But I wanted to ask you, because we had a ceasefire deal in place, and then I think that may have expired. There was a minerals deal in place. Maybe not. What's the latest with the war in Ukraine? Why isn't this war over based on what he campaigned on, which is the war would be over?
Well, I think that the problem that Trump immediately ran into is that while he does have a lot of leverage over the Ukrainians, he has almost no usable leverage over the Russians. And this isn't like some conspiracy theory that he's a Russian agent or all this stuff, right? It's just like if you look at the tools that the US has to force either of these combatants to the table, and neither side wants to stop fighting necessarily, right? The Ukrainians don't want to stop fighting and give up 20% of their country. Russia's, I wouldn't say on a roll, but the battlefield momentum has been with them for some time now. Um, he can't force Russia to really do anything. If you look at Russia's economy, Russia is already the most sanctioned country in the world. Using military force against Russia is a non-starter. This is a nuclear power. And the one thing that Trump could really do to really choke out Russia would be to sanction Russian oil and gas. But that, this is the second largest producer in the world. That would instantly cause oil prices to go to $160 and be terrible for the global economy. If Trump is going to wreck the economy, he's going to do it a different way, but not by sanctioning Russian oil and gas. So I think the problem is that I think he overestimated his ability to use kind of the stick with the Ukrainians and the carrot with the Russians. But Putin's not playing ball, right? Putin's saying, show me something else, show me something more. Drawing a line in the sand where things are right now is not necessarily enough for Putin, whose broader aim is to see the removal of a hostile government in Kiev, whether that's through military power or some kind of astroturfed opposition to Zelensky, and to ensure forever that Ukraine as an entire country remains within Russia's sphere of influence one way or another. So that's the problem that Trump ran into. I think he overestimated his ability to browbeat the Ukrainians and flatter the Russians into making a peace deal. And so here we are without a peace deal and without really anything in sight of that kind.
Everybody wants cheap airfare, but where do you find it? You call Low Cost Airlines. They specialize in cheap flights, discount hotel rooms, cheap car rental rates, and with a best price guarantee. If you want the lowest prices on your airline tickets or other travel services, call now. That's right, call. That's the only way to get these rates. Experts are standing by 24/7 to get you the cheapest airfare and hotel rates available. So don't wait. Call now.
When we think about sort of the tough talk that comes to the Trump administration in the form of tariffs and allegedly countries calling the White House, begging to make a deal, it seems as though both Putin, as you talked about, and Xi Jinping in China, some of our more notable world leaders are not necessarily taking the bait nor the bluff from the Trump White House. Is this bluster, because it's falling on deaf ears in the form of Russia and China, potentially giving the sense that the U.S. may be the emperor with no clothes on in the eyes of more powerful countries potentially in the world?
Well, Trump certainly hasn't backed down from his tariffs on China. I mean, he clarified today that the tariff on China is not actually only 125%, it's actually 145%, right? So he's not backing down on China. On Russia, Russia was one of the few countries in the world that got a 0% tariff. And people said, well, why is that? I mean, partly it's because Russia doesn't export anything of value to the United States anyway, right? So I think on the tariffs front, Trump's actions on China are consistent with his idea that China is the biggest whale of the bunch when it comes to resetting or rebalancing the U.S. trade relationship with the world, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. But his view is that its deficits are bad and China's the biggest offender. But look, I think Trump's worldview, as I said earlier, is really like it's a spheres of influence multipolar worldview. And people say, why is Trump beating up on the Europeans? Why is he forcing them to do all these things? Why isn't he focusing more on China and Russia and these others? I think he is focusing on China, but I think in his view, he's bracing for a world in which the U.S. is in competition with other powers, particularly China, right? He sees the world the way a real estate developer sees a city. It's a series of neighborhoods, and each developer's got their area, right? And so when he's threatening to take over Greenland or wants to establish control over the Panama Canal he's not going to take over Canada, but wants to bind Canada in an even more subservient relation to the U.S. My read on that is that he's preparing for a world where the U.S. needs to have its own neighborhood tight. if it's going to be in competition with China or anybody else, right? And that's consistent also with the idea that there's minimal value to trying to win over vast parts of the emerging market world with US aid and all this other kind of poverty development assistance kind of stuff. To him, that has no value, right? Because it's not hard power, right? So in Russia, in Trump's perspective, you can cut loose large parts of Africa from your soft power approach. You can cut large parts of Asia off from that. What matters is keep your own circle tight and consolidate that power. People say, well, how could it be America first if he's doing this neo-imperialist type of stuff to sort of take over other areas in the Western Hemisphere? That's exactly the point. He wants to have his own neighborhood solid because he sees the world coming where it's going to be a competition between different neighborhoods. Whether that's right or wrong, we will see. But that seems to me to be very clearly how he sees the world. And that's not a product of like years of, international relations theory. It's the result of years of experience as a real estate guy who makes deals and sees the world in terms of those, spheres of influence. So I think it translates into the global scene. We'll see if it works out, but I think that's how he sees it.
Yeah. I've never heard that analogy on the real estate development side. It's something you kind of blew my mind a little bit with that answer because I was not expecting that. And also, I've never heard anybody bring that up. So kudos to you, as always. Brilliant. Maybe it's the new microphone that's brought out this brilliance. But I did want to ask you, Alex, because, one of the things I was talking about with a friend the other day, as Rick Sanchez, who's a friend of the show, who has his own podcast, he went on Tucker Carlson's program recently. And, the two of these guys, one worked for RT here in America and Rick Sanchez. Obviously, Tucker has done his stuff in Russia. And I know the two of them have, as some members of Congress who have come on the show have talked about Kremlin talking points and stuff like that, as if the Kremlin is sending emails disseminating, hey, make sure you say this. But here's one thing that both of them had in common that I've heard a lot in that ethos, which is that Zelensky is to blame for all of this. Zelensky is the reason why this war is happening. Zelensky is a dictator because Ukraine doesn't have elections. Alex, I wanted to frame this question for you because, again, you have covered with state media in Russia and the television stations closing up, that great story that you did. You've covered all of the dangers of what Vladimir Putin does. For people that live in that ethos that are like, Zelensky's the same thing, and this is XYZ. Can you give us a moment of literacy here? And it may sound like one of the stupidest questions of all time, but explain the difference between good and evil here with respect to Ukraine and Russia. It's been blowing my mind, but as I've listened to content in that space, their big central theme, besides, like you said, USA first, we shouldn't be helping anybody, like you just mentioned about the foreign aid. The secondary part is Zelensky's all to blame for this. He's the dictator. He's the one that's canceled elections. It's the same thing. And I said, I know somebody who can explain how it's not the same thing. So go ahead, Alex.
Well, look, I mean, just to kind of give a sense of where that comes from, right? Like, parliamentary and presidential elections were in fact due in Ukraine last year in 2024. But they were not held because Ukraine is under a state of emergency, martial law, which it's been under since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. So there are people on both sides of this question. I mean, some people say, when a country is at war, it is impossible to hold a legitimate election because 20% of the country is under occupation. Millions of people have fled the country. How could you possibly get a legitimate result under those circumstances? Others say, well, if you're heading into peace negotiations of some kind, it is right and good to have someone with that legitimacy who has the support of his people, whose ideas has a mandate to walk into a room and negotiate some kind of peace. My view on this question is that people's views on whether Zelensky is legitimate or not are not based on some abstract advocacy for liberal democracy as such. They're usually a proxy for some other view, right? So people who think that Zelensky is illegitimate and is a dictator, right? They are saying that because they want him out of power or because they want Russia to run over Ukraine, or because they think that calling him illegitimate delegitimizes the larger cause of Ukraine defending itself against Russian aggression, right? And then people who say, listen, he should be able to do what he likes. He's been invaded. They say that because they think, look, Zelensky doesn't have to answer to Russian claims of illegitimacy. Who's going to answer to claims of illegitimacy from Vladimir Putin? This guy is not holding legitimate elections in his country, right? So what people say about Zelensky is a proxy for what they think about the conflict more broadly, right? To be fair, there have been rumors that Zelensky is, in fact, considering holding an election this summer. There were some reports in BBC and The Economist that they may be preparing to do it. They were going to use some election app to have people vote from abroad. We shall see, because the state of emergency, the martial law, expires in May, and the Ukrainian parliament will have to renew it. So that would be a useful time to say, okay, we're going to lift this, and then within 90 days have an election. Other people say also, Zelensky is probably as popular as he's going to be right now. So if he wanted to do it, now would be the time to do it. But again, I think all of that is kind of a distraction from the bigger issue, which is how are you going to end this conflict? And how you end this conflict has to start with a realistic understanding of how this conflict began, right? Which is, on the one hand, yes, Russia felt threatened in its sphere of influence, and on the other, it invaded a country that had done nothing to it. So you need to find an accommodation there. On the Ukrainian side, I think they, peace talks, and we've talked about this before, are going to have to involve some kind of ceding territory. I know the Ukrainians don't want to hear this, but the reality is that that's, they're not going to get 20% of Ukraine back from Russia. So finding some political solution that makes that okay, I think, is important. And so people say, well, it'll be important for Zelensky to be reelected and have a mandate if he has to go in and make some tough concessions.
Listen, if we even think you owe us money, you won't know what hit you. We'll put liens on everything you own. Raid your bank accounts, retirement fund, pension. You'll open up your paycheck and cry because we'll already have the money.
Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Shifting our focus to Gaza, recently the president and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a conversation, and the president had an interesting analogy to share about Gaza.
You know how I feel about the Gaza Strip. I think it's an incredible piece of important real estate, and I think it's something that we would be involved in, but having a peace force like the United States there controlling and owning the Gaza Strip would be a good thing. Because right now, all it is for years and years, all I hear about is killing and Hamas and problems. And if you take the people, the Palestinians, and move them around to different countries, and you have plenty of countries that will do that, and you really have a freedom zone. You call it the freedom zone, a free zone, a zone where people aren't going to be killed every day. That's a hell of a place.
On the subject of real estate, what's your take on Trump's analysis of what U.S. positioning in Gaza could look like?
Well, I think it's interesting that he said, for years all I hear about is killing and Hamas and Gaza or whatever it is, as though this is some abstract thing that just happens there for no
And he left
reason.
out one party in that conversation.
Right. Yeah. To go back to what I said earlier about these spheres of influence, I thought what was interesting about the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu was that Trump gave Netanyahu and continues to give Netanyahu a green light to do pretty much whatever he pleases in Gaza and in the West Bank as well. Note also that the kind of annexation of the West Bank is sort of happening slowly and then all at once, to paraphrase Hemingway. Trump views Israel's prerogatives in the Palestinian territories as complete, right? But if you looked at the meeting, Trump actually differed with Netanyahu and didn't give him a whole lot on three other key things. One was trade. Netanyahu showed the ostensible purpose of that meeting was Netanyahu showed up to try and get the 17% so-called reciprocal tariff on Israel lifted. And Netanyahu sat there and said, we will very quickly eliminate the entire trade deficit, our entire Israel's entire trade surplus with the United States, and we'll do it very quickly. And yes, sir. And Trump said thank you and then did absolutely nothing about it. So Netanyahu got nothing on trade. On the other issue that Netanyahu cares a lot about, which was Iran, Trump basically, I don't want to say defied, but basically completely ignored Netanyahu's concern about Iran by saying, we're going to hold nuclear talks with Iran. The Israelis don't want that. Netanyahu doesn't want that, right? Netanyahu's view is that the only way to solve the Iranian nuclear problem is to bomb the Iranian nuclear problem. Of course, he can't do that without U.S. help. So Trump sat there and said, you know, we're actually going to talk to the Iranians. That was strike number 2 for Netanyahu. And strike number 3 was when Trump basically said, you know, let me work out your problems with Turkey, right? The Israelis and Turkey are clashing a little bit over Syria. Just briefly, since the government of Bashar al-Assad fell, the militia that overthrew them was backed by Turkey, and now they're in charge in Syria. And Turkey has been establishing military relations with the new regime in Syria, while Israel has been bombing military sites around Syria and establishing what it views as a kind of buffer zone in Syria to prevent any hostile regime in Syria from attacking Israel. So the Israelis and the Turks are clashing a little bit over Syria. And Trump didn't give Netanyahu anything on that either. He said, you know, if you're reasonable, I can probably work something out between you and Turkey. So I thought it was interesting that again, we have this sphere of influence view where there's a little sphere of influence that Israel has over the Palestinians, and Trump will back the Israelis whatever they want to do. He has no sympathy at all for the Palestinian cause. But on these other things, he does have an issue, and he sees them as U.S. prerogatives, and he's telling Netanyahu to stand down. The one place where those two things may clash, and this is what I would watch, is when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Because Trump has a very good relationship with the Saudis. He very much wants to broker this normalization deal between Saudi and the Israelis. The Israelis and the Saudis were super into that until October 7th, and that blew things apart. The one condition that the Saudis have for normalizing relations with Israel is that there be a viable and credible sketch, something that points to a Palestinian state someday. Right? That's the one thing that the Saudis insist on. And, you know, those who know the region know the Saudis don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the Palestinians as such, but, you know, as the custodians of the holy sites of Islam and as rivals of the Iranians who've been backing the Palestinians for 40 years, the Saudis feel obligated to say, no, this is our line in the sand, as it were. We will not do a peace deal with Israel unless the Palestinians are included. And that's where I think the two kind of things are going to clash, where Trump wants to let the Israelis handle the Palestinian situation however Netanyahu wants to, and possibly with U.S. real estate help to do this grotesque plan of turning Gaza into an ethnically cleansed Riviera. But if that clashes with what Trump wants to do with the Saudis, which is have a good relationship with them and broker this normalization deal, that's where you're going to see the tension.
You know, Alex, you mentioned a couple of things there, and we're looking at this worldview. So I want to kind of ask you a question about the person who's supposed to be relaying the president's message on the world stage, and that's Marco Rubio. I did want to ask you about something that is playing out with Rubio here at home, and kind of your perspective on it and how we're being viewed around the world with respect to this story. Take a listen to something that Rubio said earlier today as we're recording this in the cabinet meeting seen around the world with Elon Musk and the rest of the cabinet.
We're going to continue to do it. So when we identify lunatics like these, we take away their student visa. No one's entitled to a student visa. The press covers student visas like there's some sort of birthright. No, a student visa is like me inviting you into my home. If you come into my home and put all kinds of crap on my couch, I'm going to kick you out of my house.
So I wanted to ask you because, look, you've covered protests in other countries. What's happening with Romesa Uzturk and that story, what's happening with the Khalil story up in New York, I believe, there's a bunch of instances of student visas being revoked. And the way immigration enforcement is, you know, kind of capturing these people and taking them off the streets and putting them in centers. And then we've got to figure it out from the legal perspective. I'm curious for you because Congressman Seth Moulton was on this show last week, and he said some of these videos, they look like they come out of Iran. They look like they come out of China, the way we are enforcing this. But it is within the State Department's purview to cancel these student visas if they want. There's precedent from the Carter administration, as somebody once told me on this program, with what happened with the Iranian hostage situation in 79. So I'm curious for you, though, as somebody who has covered foreign affairs when you see something like this that's happening here in the U.S. as a journalist, are you concerned at the way this is looking, the way it's being perceived on the global stage? Is this being done right? What's your read on some of the things that have been playing out with these student visas and the way they've been revoked and the way the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement has enforced the law here?
Yeah. I mean, on one level, the U.S. In every administration does something that you say to yourself, "Wow, if if an authoritarian regime did that, the press would be covering it." Like, right? I mean, the entire Bush era was like that. Obama with drone strikes, and deportation. So there's always something that the U.S. is doing, which, viewed through the lens of how would this look if another country were doing it, looks uglier than it does to us. Look, this administration has taken an extreme view of the powers that it can use to police who's here and saying what about what issues. As you mentioned, unfortunately, there is at least legal room or dispute about the legal room. It's an open question to what extent there's legal room for them to be doing these deportations. But even if it's narrowly speaking legal, I think the signal that it sends is what we're really talking about, right? And I think it's sending a signal that the U.S. is not necessarily a place for free inquiry by students, or is not necessarily a place that will actively support scientific research or research of many kinds because of strong ideological guardrails, or just because they don't think certain kinds of research matter. That's not necessarily a winning formula, particularly if you think you're going to be in a competition with other blocs in the world, right? So, I can see the narrow argument. Well, yes, such and such article of such and such statutory law or Title X of whatever, says that students can be deported for very vague reasons. I get it, right? We still have, my wife just became a citizen last summer. And when you become a citizen of the state, they still ask you, are you a member of the Communist Party? Have you ever been a Nazi? Like all these things, right? So the government has a power to police who comes in and who doesn't. And I think at a certain level, we do want that. But the way it's playing out is that there is a kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say McCarthyism just yet, but that there is a very strong ideological bent on who can come here and what they can say and what they cannot say. And irrespective of the legal merits of one case or another, which in their own right may be grotesque, I think the larger message is a bad one, because it's saying you can't come here and speak freely and think freely. And listen, there have been issues on this on both sides of the ideological spectrum, but what's happening right now, I think, is ultimately damaging to us in the world.
Real estate development, this is what the world is. This is what I learned. There's blocks out there. Also, if you can, Alex, leave your 15% tariff at the end of this episode for Nick and I. You can just Venmo that to us, and you can go check out all of Alex's work over at GZEROmedia.com. He does fantastic work. Alex Kliment, can't thank you enough, buddy, as always, for hopping on the program. Continued success to you, buddy. Please stay safe.
Nick, Mike, always a pleasure. Thank you.